It was just another quiet afternoon at the diner. The soft buzz of a neon sign outside flickered intermittently, casting a glow on the worn leather booths. A waitress with a friendly smile refilled mugs of coffee. The sound of clinking dishes echoed from the kitchen, and the low hum of classic rock played in the background. For most, it was a peaceful refuge from the world outside. But for Keanu Reeves, this ordinary moment would soon spiral into something entirely unexpected. Keanu stepped inside the diner, his presence as unassuming as ever. Clad in a simple jacket and jeans, his face mostly hidden by dark sunglasses, he could have been any other man enjoying a quiet meal. But those around him couldn't help but glance his way. The unmistakable figure, the one they had seen on the big screen for years, stood out even in this low-key setting. Yet Keanu didn't seem to notice the eyes on him. He simply made his way to an empty booth in the back and slid into the seat, laying down a brown leather folder on the table in front of him. The waitress, a young woman named Molly, approached with a smile. "The usual?" she asked, already reaching for her notepad. "Yeah, just coffee for now," Keanu replied in his signature calm voice. His eyes flickered briefly to the folder, as if double-checking something inside before he spoke again. "Thanks," Molly nodded, moving away to grab his coffee. Keanu shifted his gaze to the napkin on the table, picking up a pen and starting to scribble some notes. His concentration was deep, almost as though the world around him didn't exist. But he wasn't the only one in the diner with a purpose. In the corner, 2 undercover officers sat at a small table, their eyes scanning the room casually, yet with purpose. Detective James Turner and his partner, Officer Sarah Mallory, had been quietly investigating a string of high-tech thefts in the area. The case was delicate, and the suspects were elusive, but the two had a hunch. Something about the quiet, inconspicuous diner seemed like the perfect place for answers. Turner looked across the room at Keanu, noting how the actor was seated alone, his demeanor calm and collected. Something about it felt off. It wasn't just his fame, it was the way he carried himself, like he was hiding something. The folder, the way his pen moved rapidly across the napkin, his intense focus on something no one else could see. Turner exchanged a glance with Mallory, who raised an eyebrow, silently questioning whether they should approach. "Something doesn't sit right with me," Turner murmured. "I get that vibe too," Mallory whispered back. "But it's Keanu Reeves, right? Famous actor. I mean, what are we even thinking?" Turner didn't reply immediately. Instead, he watched as Keanu leaned forward, his brow furrowed in concentration. The napkin, which seemed like just a trivial object moments ago, now felt like a key, a clue. "Just keep an eye on him," Turner said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to be sure." The officers continued to observe, and a small knot of tension began to form in the air. Keanu hadn't noticed them yet, but something was about to draw him into their world, and something was about to draw them into his. The last thing any of them expected was that the situation would escalate in a way none of them could have predicted. Molly returned with the coffee, placing it down in front of Keanu with a smile. She noticed the intensity in his eyes, the way he seemed distant, like he was in his own world. She didn't think much of it. Famous people were known for their quirks. But as she turned to leave, something caught her attention. The officers had subtly moved closer, their heads tilted, their attention firmly locked on the table where Keanu was working. And then, just as Molly was about to walk away, the unexpected happened. Turner stood up, glancing at Mallory as he approached Keanu's booth. There was no real danger in sight, but instinct told him to proceed cautiously. He cleared his throat, and Keanu looked up, meeting his gaze. "Mr. Reeves?" Turner began, his voice polite but firm. "Could we have a word?" Keanu blinked, momentarily thrown off guard. The tension in the air was palpable. For a brief second, his eyes flickered to the folder in front of him, then back to the officer. Something wasn't right. "Is everything all right?" Keanu asked, his calm voice betraying no emotion. "Everything's fine, just some routine questions," Turner said, taking a step closer. Mallory stood behind him, her arms crossed, eyeing the situation with curiosity. Keanu's brow furrowed slightly, but he nodded, sliding the folder aside. "What is this about?" Before Turner could respond, his eyes fell on the contents of Keanu's desk, something strange among the papers. A small device, half covered by the folder, caught the light. Its sleek, metallic form seemed out of place in the casual diner environment. Turner's heart rate quickened, and for the briefest moment he forgot who was sitting in front of him. His mind raced with thoughts of espionage, covert operations, or worse. "This is a device," Mallory muttered under her breath, leaning forward to get a better look. Keanu noticed the shift in their expressions, the sudden tension between them. He realized they hadn't come to chat about his meal. He could feel the gears of suspicion grinding into motion. And just like that, his ordinary lunch had turned into something far more complicated than he could have ever imagined. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The silence at the table was thick, charged with tension. Keanu could feel the weight of their gaze on him as the two officers stared at the small device on his desk. His heart skipped a beat, but his face remained calm, unreadable. He had been in enough tight spots in his life, both on screen and off, to keep his composure. He cleared his throat, trying to break the ice. "Look, this is a misunderstanding," Keanu said, trying to sound as casual as possible. "So I'm just here for some lunch." Detective Turner leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Mr. Reeves, we're not here to cause trouble, but that," he motioned toward the object, "doesn't look like something you'd casually bring to a diner." Keanu followed his gaze, seeing the shiny, metallic object, partially concealed under his folder. It wasn't the first time he'd brought it with him, but he hadn't expected to be caught like this. He hadn't expected anyone to think it was anything but what it was, a harmless prototype he was working on for a potential tech project. But now, with the officers scrutinizing it, it looked more like a weapon than an invention. "Look, it's not what you think," Keanu said, trying to stay calm. "It's part of a project I'm working on. It's a prototype, nothing illegal, nothing dangerous." Turner took a deep breath and exchanged a quick glance with Mallory. "A prototype?" Turner repeated, his voice still filled with doubt. "That looks more like something you'd find in a lab, not a diner." Keanu's heart raced. He wasn't used to being questioned like this. He was an actor, not a criminal. Yet, as the two officers continued to circle his booth with suspicion in their eyes, he couldn't help but feel like a cornered animal. "I can explain," Keanu started again, but the words caught in his throat. He wasn't sure how much he should say, how much he could say. The prototype was something he'd been working on in secret, something that could change the world, but at the same time, it could also get him into a lot of trouble. "Why don't you show us exactly what it is?" Mallory asked, her voice a little sharper than before. Keanu hesitated. This wasn't supposed to happen like this. He hadn't planned for anyone to get involved. He hadn't planned for them to get involved. But the officers weren't backing down. They needed answers, and fast. With a heavy sigh, Keanu opened the folder and gently slid the small device toward them. "It's a communications system," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's not a weapon, it's for disaster relief, to help people in crisis situations. It can help restore communications where there's been a blackout or a natural disaster. It's meant to save lives." Turner looked at him skeptically, not entirely convinced. "That's quite the claim, Mr. Reeves," he said, his tone still thick with suspicion. "This doesn't look like a typical disaster relief tool." Keanu's frustration was starting to bubble up. "I'm telling you, it's not what it seems. It's not even finished. I'm still working on it with a team of engineers. But we've had some setbacks, and I've had to keep it low profile." Mallory stepped forward, leaning down to get a closer look at the device. She was quiet for a moment, analyzing the pieces carefully. Keanu could see her mind working, her skepticism shifting slightly, but there was still something in her eyes that said she wasn't ready to let go of the doubt. "All right, let's say this is a prototype," she said slowly, glancing at her partner. "Why are you here in a diner with this? Why not take it to your lab or wherever you're working?" Keanu could feel the heat rising in his chest, his patience fraying. "Because I needed a break. I wanted to get out of my house for a while. I didn't expect to get questioned by the police when I just wanted some lunch," he replied, his voice slightly sharper than intended. There was a tense moment of silence. The officers exchanged another look, this time more thoughtful than before. Turner wasn't sure if he should continue to press Keanu, but the doubts in his mind were mounting. The situation felt off. On the one hand, he wanted to believe Keanu's story. He didn't think the actor was involved in anything illegal. But the device, it looked too advanced, too out of place for a casual diner meeting. "Mr. Reeves, we're going to need you to come with us," Turner said finally, his voice no longer sounding like a suggestion. "We need to clear this up." Keanu blinked, startled by the sudden change in tone. "What? No, you can't do that. I'm not under arrest." "We're not arresting you," Turner responded. "But we need to take you in for questioning. It's standard procedure when dealing with potentially sensitive materials." Keanu's mind raced. He didn't want to make this more complicated than it already was, but he knew that if he went with them now, the entire project, everything he'd worked on, would be exposed. His whole life, his reputation, the fragile balance he'd maintained, in his personal and professional worlds could come crashing down. But before Keanu could say anything more, an unexpected voice interrupted the tense standoff. "To Detective Turner," a deep voice called from the door. The officers turned in surprise, and Keanu's heart sank as he recognized the person who had just walked into the diner. Standing in the doorway was an older man, grizzled, with a calm yet authoritative presence. He was no stranger to Keanu. This was Jonathan Harris, a former colleague, someone who had worked with Keanu on several tech projects years ago, someone who knew the truth about the prototype. "John," Keanu called out, relief flooding his voice. "Everything's fine, Keanu," Harris said, walking toward the table. He glanced at the officers. "Detective Turner, Officer Mallory, I think we need to clear a few things up." The tension in the air didn't vanish completely, but for the first time since the officers arrived, Keanu felt like he wasn't completely alone. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Detective Turner and Officer Mallory exchanged a look, their skepticism still heavy in the air, but they both seemed to relax slightly at the arrival of Jonathan Harris. Turner's expression softened, as if he recognized the older man, while Mallory's gaze lingered on Harris, curious about the sudden shift in the room's energy. "Do you know this man?" Turner asked, his voice a little less confrontational now. Keanu nodded, his relief palpable. "Yeah, this is Jonathan Harris. We worked together on a few projects a while back. He's one of the people who knows about the device." Harris, his face as calm and composed as ever, moved to the booth and gave Keanu a reassuring look before addressing the officers. "I can vouch for Keanu," Harris said, his tone firm yet friendly. "What you're looking at is exactly what he said it is, a prototype for disaster relief. It's still in its early stages, but it's legitimate. We've been working on this in collaboration with a few engineers. It's not a weapon, and it certainly isn't anything illegal." Mallory's eyes narrowed as she looked between Harris and Keanu. "And why is it being kept under wraps?" she asked, still cautious. "Why would someone like Keanu Reeves, of all people, be involved with something like this in the first place?" Harris leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping a bit in volume, as if he was about to reveal something confidential. "The truth is, it's a delicate project," he explained. "We're testing it in real-world environments, and Keanu's been involved because of his unique perspective. The device could revolutionize how emergency communications work in isolated areas, but it's not ready for the public yet, not in the way that would give the wrong impression." Turner didn't look entirely convinced, but Mallory seemed to be considering the explanation more seriously now. "And you've been working with Keanu on this? How long has this been going on?" Harris hesitated for a second, glancing at Keanu. "Long enough that I'd trust him with something like this. It's not about fame or money for him. It's about the potential to help people, to save lives in critical situations." Keanu watched as the officers processed Harris's words. He could see that the tension was slowly starting to dissipate, but he knew it wasn't over. He had no idea what the officers' next steps would be, and as much as he wanted to move on with his day, he could tell the situation had only gotten more complicated. "This is still a lot to take in," Mallory finally spoke, crossing her arms again. "We can't just walk away from this without verifying everything. If it's really what you say it is, then we'll need confirmation from the lab and a few other people in your team." Harris nodded. "Of course, I'll make the necessary calls, but I assure you, we'll have all the proof you need. This is not what you think it is." He turned to Keanu and gave him a slight, almost imperceptible smile, as if to reassure him that things would be okay. Keanu took a deep breath, his hands still gripping the edge of the booth as if steadying himself against the growing weight of the situation. He hadn't wanted this, hadn't wanted his lunch to turn into an interrogation, but now he felt like he was standing on the edge of something bigger than he ever could have imagined. The device on the table, the one he thought was just another project, was now at the center of a mystery, and he had no idea how deep this rabbit hole went. Turner studied him for a moment longer, clearly weighing his options. He then turned to Mallory and nodded subtly. "All right, we'll need to get in touch with your team, Mr. Harris," he said, his tone now more neutral. "And we'll need to follow protocol, but I'll hold off on any further actions for now." Keanu exhaled slowly, finally feeling the tightness in his chest loosen. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft but genuine. As the officers stepped back, Harris turned his attention to Keanu, his face betraying none of the anxiety that Keanu was feeling. "Don't worry," Harris reassured him. "I'll make sure everything checks out. You've got enough on your plate as it is." Keanu managed a small nod, but inside a storm was brewing. The last thing he wanted was for this project to be linked to something sinister. If word got out about the device, about what it could really do, the consequences could be severe. And worse yet, if someone with the wrong intentions got their hands on it, there was no telling what could happen. "How's the testing going, anyway?" Keanu asked, trying to distract himself from the tension. It was a question he'd been meaning to ask Harris for a while, but had pushed aside due to his own busy schedule. Harris shrugged, his face grim. "It's been tough," he said. "We've had a few setbacks. Some of the communication links aren't as stable as we'd like them to be, but we're making progress. I'm confident that once we have the right support, this will be a game changer." Keanu nodded, even though he felt a little uncertain about Harris's confidence. As much as he trusted the older man, he knew the reality of the tech world was far from straightforward. Things could go wrong quickly, and the stakes were higher than either of them might have anticipated. Just as Keanu was about to respond, the diner's door opened again with a soft jingle. A new customer stepped in, and the clattering of their feet against the floor snapped Keanu back to the present. For a moment, it felt like nothing had changed, like the quiet rhythm of the diner had returned. But Keanu knew better. This moment would mark the beginning of something bigger, something that might change his life forever. The device, the secret, the officers, it was all linked, and he was at the center of it all. "Look," Harris said, snapping Keanu from his thoughts, "I'll handle everything. Just stay calm. This won't get out of hand. We'll get the truth out there." Keanu nodded again, but his mind was already racing. There was a feeling, deep in his gut, that something was about to unravel. And when it did, nothing in his life would ever be the same. The tension in the diner began to fade, but Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that this situation was far from over. He had expected a quiet lunch, perhaps a break from the chaos of his hectic life. Instead, he found himself tangled in a web of questions, suspicions, and the unexpected intervention of Jonathan Harris. Still, there was a small part of him that felt a sliver of hope. If Harris could clear everything up, maybe they could avoid the fallout. Harris had made a few calls already, speaking quietly into his phone, and Turner had backed off for the moment, though the detective's sharp eyes never left Keanu for too long. Mallory, however, had returned to her seat, her fingers drumming idly on the edge of the table. She was quiet now, but Keanu could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. The door to the diner opened again, and another figure stepped inside. This time. It was a woman, tall and confident. Her dark hair swept into a professional bun. She wore a tailored suit and moved with purpose, scanning the room as if she already knew what was going on. Keanu's heart skipped a beat. He recognized her immediately. It was Sarah Williams, a well-known tech consultant with ties to several major corporations. She was someone Harris had worked with in the past, someone whose name carried weight, and she was looking right at him. "Jonathan," Sarah said, her voice smooth yet carrying an edge of urgency. "I got your message. What's going on?" Harris stood up quickly, his expression a mix of relief and wariness. "Sarah, thank God. These officers here think Keanu's involved in something illegal, but I'm telling them it's all above board. This is about the communications device we've been working on. There's no threat here." Sarah turned her gaze to Turner and Mallory, her eyes sharp. "I assume you've been briefed, Detective?" she said, her tone cool and professional. Turner nodded, but his suspicion didn't waver. "We've been looking into this," he said, eyeing Sarah carefully, "but until we verify everything, we're not going to take any chances." Keanu shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had expected Harris to bring someone like Sarah into the fold, but seeing her now, standing across the table, cool and confident, made the reality of the situation hit harder. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. The people involved were high stakes, and it seemed like the device was far more important than he had initially thought. "Sarah," Keanu began, trying to break the tension. "What's going on? What's really happening with this project?" Sarah didn't immediately answer. Instead, she took a seat across from him, her eyes focused on the officers. "Let's not make a scene, okay?" she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'll handle this." Keanu could feel his pulse quicken. What did she mean by handle this? It didn't sound like it was going to be as simple as just proving the device was harmless. Sarah's involvement made him realize that there were layers to this situation, layers that he wasn't fully aware of. Turner and Mallory exchanged a look. Sarah was clearly someone they respected, but that didn't mean they were ready to back down completely. "We'll need to verify everything," Turner said again. "No one is leaving until we've checked out the facts." "This isn't a simple case." Sarah remained unfazed. "That's fine, verify it," she said, her voice taking on a slightly colder edge. "But let me be clear. If you think you're going to detain Keanu or cause a scene over something that's not even a threat, you'll be hearing from my legal team. This project is backed by some of the most reputable names in tech. If this is a misunderstanding, I suggest we clear it up without any further delays." Mallory raised an eyebrow. "You don't seem worried at all." Sarah smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I don't need to be worried. I know exactly what's going on. You're just a couple of steps behind." Her gaze flicked to Keanu, and for the first time since this had all started, she seemed to offer him a small, reassuring smile. Keanu wasn't sure if he should be comforted or if that smile was just a part of the game she was playing. There was something about her, something about the way she carried herself, that made him feel like he was only just beginning to understand the full scale of what he was caught up in. Suddenly, the door to the diner swung open again, and a man in a black suit stepped inside. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a sharp jawline that looked like it had been chiseled from stone. His eyes scanned the room quickly before he locked onto Sarah, a slight nod of acknowledgement passing between them. Sarah stood up, a subtle shift in her posture. "This is Agent Carter," she said to the officers, her tone now clipped and official. "He's from the Department of Homeland Security. If you want confirmation of Keanu's involvement with the project and the legitimacy of the device, he's the one you need to talk to." Agent Carter walked toward the table, his stride confident and unhurried. The moment he stepped closer, Keanu could feel a chill run through the air. There was something about the man that screamed authority. He wasn't just a government agent. He was someone who dealt with situations far above the ordinary. Turner and Mallory exchanged a look. This was getting far more complicated than they had anticipated. "Homeland Security?" Turner said, his voice skeptical. "What's going on here?" Agent Carter didn't waste any time on pleasantries. He looked directly at the officers and spoke in a voice that left no room for argument. "You're looking at something that goes well beyond local law enforcement," he said. "This project isn't just about communication systems for disaster relief. It's part of a larger initiative. What Keanu and his team have developed is classified, and it's not for public knowledge yet." Keanu's mind raced. "Classified?" he repeated, barely able to process what he was hearing. "I had no idea. This was bigger than I thought." Carter nodded, his gaze sharp. "It's not just a simple device. It's a prototype that could change how we handle national security, emergency response, and even global communications. It's been in development for years, and it's been kept under wraps for a reason. If you were to try to go public with this, things would get out of hand quickly. The weight of Carter's words settled in Keanu's chest. He had unwittingly walked into a web of government secrecy, and now there was no turning back. The device, the project, even the mysterious people surrounding it, everything had just gotten a whole lot more complicated. Keanu sat back, his mind racing with everything that had just happened. The quiet diner, which had been a place for a simple meal, had transformed into a stage for a much larger, more dangerous play. The arrival of Agent Carter and his cryptic words about the device's true purpose left Keanu feeling more trapped than ever. He had thought he was simply helping with a small, innovative project, a communication device to aid in disaster. Relief. But now he learned that this device was part of something far greater. He had no idea how deep the government's involvement went, or why they were suddenly so interested in him. Agent Carter's presence alone seemed to shift the atmosphere in the diner. The officers, once skeptical and questioning, now seemed to be second-guessing their next steps. Mallory, the more quiet officer, had a furrowed brow while Turner had turned slightly pale, as though the realization of what they were facing was settling in. "All right, let's take a step back," Carter said, his voice calm yet authoritative. He didn't sit down, but instead stood, casting a long shadow over the booth. "This is not a simple misunderstanding. You're dealing with something that could have national security implications. Keanu Reeves and his involvement with this project is far more than just public interest." Keanu opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. He wasn't sure if he was angry, scared, or just in disbelief. "You mean to say that I'm part of some kind of national security operation?" he asked, his voice coming out more incredulously than he'd intended. Carter nodded, his expression as cold as ever. "Not part, but yes, your involvement in this device, in this project, makes you an important piece. This isn't something you can just walk away from." Keanu's hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. "I didn't sign up for any of this. I thought this was just about creating something useful for disaster relief. How did it become classified? How did it become a national security issue?" Sarah, who had been mostly silent, spoke up now. "That's the question, Keanu. And the truth is, we all got a little too far ahead of ourselves. The device was initially meant to help save lives in remote areas. It would create instant, secure communications channels during disasters, places where the internet doesn't reach, where cellular networks fail." She paused, and Keanu could see a flicker of guilt in her eyes. "But once we tested it, the possibilities expanded. We realized it could be used for far more than just communication. It could be used to control entire networks of emergency systems. It could be used in defense, intelligence, and military operations. It became something much bigger than we expected." Keanu's heart sank. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "So, you're telling me that I've been testing a device that could be used for military purposes, and I had no idea?" Sarah's gaze softened slightly, but she didn't deny it. "That's the crux of it. We didn't think it would get this far. We were supposed to keep it small, keep it under wraps, but things got out of hand. The government got involved, and now it's classified." "Classified," Keanu repeated, his mind spinning. "And now you're telling me that this device could be used for things I never imagined. And I'm caught in the middle of it." Mallory leaned forward slightly, her voice more sympathetic now. "Keanu, it's not as bad as it sounds. This is still about saving lives. The intention behind the device is good, but the stakes are much higher than anyone realized. There are people who would do anything to get their hands on this kind of technology." Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that he was being swept into something much darker than he ever signed up for. "So, what now?" he asked, his voice low, his hands trembling slightly. "What happens to me, to this project?" Carter took a step forward, locking eyes with Keanu. "What happens now is that we need to ensure this device stays out of the wrong hands, and that means you stay involved, whether you want to or not." Keanu's pulse quickened. "I didn't sign up to be involved in some government operation. This isn't what I agreed to." Sarah shot him a look, her expression unreadable. "I know it's overwhelming, but you're in this now, Keanu. The device is far too valuable, and it's already in play. People are watching, and if you back out, you'll only make things worse. Keanu leaned back in his seat, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. This wasn't the quiet lunch he'd imagined. This wasn't just a project he could walk away from. He was in the middle of something he couldn't fully understand, something much bigger than he was prepared for. Suddenly, Turner spoke up, breaking the silence. "So what's the plan now? You expect us to just believe that everything is above board and we walk away, no questions asked?" Carter's eyes flicked to Turner, his gaze sharp. "What you believe is irrelevant," he said coldly. "You've been briefed. There's no turning back now. If you want to continue questioning, fine, but understand this. You're not in control here anymore. The safety of this device is paramount. We don't need any more distractions." Keanu felt the weight of the room closing in on him. He wasn't sure who was pulling the strings, Harris, Sarah, or the government. But one thing was clear. The device, the project, and his own involvement had escalated to something far beyond his comprehension. The officers exchanged another look, and Keanu could tell they were weighing their options. Turner, the more vocal, of the two, sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "This is a mess," he muttered, clearly trying to come to terms with the whirlwind of revelations. "But if it's as big as you say, we'll back off for now. We'll need to stay in the loop, though. There's no way we can just walk away from something this big." Carter nodded, his eyes unblinking. "Of course, but remember, this is not something you get to control. Your role is simple. Stay out of the way and allow us to handle the rest. If you try to expose this or get in the way, things could get much worse." Keanu's stomach churned with the reality of it all. This was far from over. He hadn't even begun to process the magnitude of what he was involved in. But one thing was clear. His life was no longer just about acting or helping with small tech projects. He had been pulled into something that could change everything. As Carter and Sarah spoke with the officers, arranging the next steps, Keanu sat in silence, his thoughts spiraling. He wanted to leave, to walk away from all of it. But he couldn't. Not now, and so he waited. The diner's once comforting atmosphere felt like a distant memory. The quiet hum of conversation, the clink of silverware against plates. Now it all seemed muffled as Keanu sat at the table, feeling the weight of the situation press down on him like an anchor. Outside, the world seemed to continue on as normal, oblivious to the storm that was brewing just inside those walls. Agent Carter, Sarah, and the officers were still engaged in a low conversation by the counter. The noise of their murmurs blended with the soft rustling of paper as Turner shuffled through some files, clearly frustrated. Mallory was the quieter one, her eyes narrowing every so often as she observed the group. Keanu couldn't help but feel that they were just as confused and uneasy as he was, but that didn't make things any less intimidating. "What now?" Keanu muttered under his breath. Sarah, who had stepped away for a moment, returned to the table, her heels clicking sharply against the diner's tiled floor. She looked like she was ready to take on a battlefield, her demeanor steely and unwavering. But there was something in her eyes, something guarded, that made Keanu pause. "They're not going to arrest you," she said, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "But it doesn't mean this is over, not by a long shot." Keanu swallowed, trying to steady his nerves. "What do you mean? What exactly is this? Why did you bring me into this mess?" Sarah's gaze softened for a brief moment, but she didn't answer immediately. She stared out the window for a moment, then back at Keanu. "You've been a part of this project for a while now. I didn't expect it to get to this point, but here we are." Keanu leaned forward, his voice growing desperate. "This isn't some random tech project anymore, is it? This is something big, bigger than anything I could have imagined. What did I get myself into?" Sarah exhaled slowly, as if she had been waiting for him to finally ask the question. "It started with good intentions," she said, almost as if trying to convince herself more than him. "The device we've been working on has potential. It could revolutionize emergency communication systems, global security, even military strategies. But somewhere along the way, people started to see it as more than a tool for good. They saw it as a weapon." Keanu recoiled at the word. "A weapon?" "Not just a weapon," she replied quietly. "A way to control entire systems, networks, communication infrastructures, military operations. Think about it. If someone gained control of that device, they could manipulate information, disrupt communication, lines, and even change the way governments interact on a global scale. Keanu's breath caught in his throat. You're telling me that this device I thought was just going to help people could be used to start wars? Not if we can stop it, Sarah said, her voice firm. But we're up against a ticking clock. People are already trying to get their hands on it. There are those who will do anything to use it for their own gain, and they have no regard for who gets hurt along the way. Keanu couldn't take it in. The idea that a small communication device could change the entire course of global events seemed too surreal. He had thought his involvement was just a part of a charity project, helping people in need. He had never signed up to be a pawn in a geopolitical game. You said we can stop it, but how? He asked. How can we stop something this huge? We're already doing it, Sarah replied. By keeping this under wraps and moving it through the proper channels, we're making sure that it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. But right now, that's not enough. There are factions within the government, foreign interests, and powerful corporations all trying to get control of this technology. Keanu's mind was reeling, trying to digest the reality of it all. He was no longer just a part of a team working on a good cause. He was an unwitting player in a high-stakes game that he couldn't even begin to understand. But why me? Keanu asked. I'm just an actor. I don't know anything about defense systems or global security. Why did you bring me into this? Sarah looked him dead in the eye. Because you're trustworthy, Keanu. You've worked with us on the tech for months now, and no one else is as committed to seeing this through. You're the last person anyone would suspect. You're a symbol of safety, of good intentions. That makes you invaluable. Keanu was silent for a long moment. He wasn't sure if he should feel flattered or terrified. He had never asked for this kind of responsibility. You're asking me to be a part of something that could change the world, he said slowly, his voice low. But I didn't sign up for this, Sarah. I didn't want to be part of some classified government operation. She nodded, her face serious. I know, but it's too late now. You're already in it, and people are already watching. Keanu's chest tightened. The thought of being watched, of having his every move scrutinized, made his skin crawl. He had never been in a situation like this before. His life, once simple and predictable, had just been turned upside down. Outside, the sun had started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the diner. The warm glow of the neon sign flickered, casting an eerie light through the windows. Sarah, I need time to think, Keanu said, his voice quiet. This is too much. I understand, she said, her tone softer now. Take all the time you need, but know this. The clock is ticking. We don't have much time before someone makes a move, and once that happens, everything changes. Keanu looked out the window, his mind awash with conflicting thoughts. How could he go back to his normal life after this? How could he unlearn the truth that had been revealed to him? A part of him wanted to run, to leave everything behind and forget it all. But there was another part of him, the part that had always believed in doing what was right, that urged him to stand firm and figure out how to fix this. But the more he thought about it, the more it felt like he was standing on the edge of something much bigger than himself, something he couldn't escape. And the worst part, he wasn't sure if he even wanted to. The world outside the diner had taken on a haunting stillness, as if even the night itself had paused in anticipation of what was to come. Keanu sat in his booth, a cup of coffee now cold and untouched in front of him. His mind was in overdrive, trying to piece together the fragments of information that had been thrown at him in the last few hours. Every glance at the officers, every word spoken by Sarah, had brought him closer to realizing that his life would never be the same. The quiet hum of the diner's neon sign was the only sound breaking the silence. That was until a sharp knock on the door broke his reverie. Keanu, Sarah said, her voice low as she stepped into the booth with a look that suggested urgency. We need to leave now. Keanu's eyes flicked toward her, his body tense. What's going on? He asked, standing up slowly. His heart raced as he searched Sarah's face for any hint of what was happening. He could tell something had changed. Something was coming. Sarah motioned for him to follow her, glancing toward the window. Her voice lowered even further as she spoke. I don't have time to explain everything, but we've just received intel that someone knows about the device. They're coming after. Sharon, they're coming after you. Keanu felt the blood drain from his face. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. What do you mean someone knows about it? We're not even supposed to be involved in this operation. I know, Sarah said, her expression hardening. But now they know who you are. You've become a target. You're not just a witness anymore. You're a key player, and they'll stop at nothing to get their hands on you. Before Keanu could respond, he noticed Turner and Mallory walking toward the table, their faces grim. Keanu hadn't realized it before, but there was something different about the way they were acting now. Mallory had her hand on her holster, a sign that something was wrong, and Turner's eyes were darting around the room, clearly on high alert. "We need to move now," Turner said, his voice low and controlled. "Carter's already gone to secure a safe house. We'll head there immediately. But we don't have much time." Keanu's mind was spinning. He was being told to leave everything behind, to trust people he barely knew. The fear, the uncertainty, all of it was crashing over him in waves. He'd never been in a situation like this before, never had to look over his shoulder. And now he was being told that there were people hunting him down. "You're sure this is real?" Keanu asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "I mean, how do we know this isn't some kind of trap?" Sarah met his gaze with a steady, unwavering look. "We don't know for sure. But the people coming after you aren't the kind you can outrun or hide from. You'll need to trust us if you want to survive this." Keanu swallowed hard, his throat dry. He was being pulled deeper into a world he didn't understand, and the walls around him were closing in faster than he could process. The urgency in Sarah's eyes left no room for argument. With a deep breath, he nodded. "Okay, let's go." The officers moved quickly, ushering him out of the diner and into the dark night beyond. The cool air hit him like a slap in the face, the quiet of the street feeling suffocating. Keanu's car, the one he had driven just hours earlier, now felt like a relic of a different life, one that was quickly slipping away. Mallory led the way, her eyes constantly scanning the area. Turner kept a few paces ahead, his steps purposeful. Sarah fell in beside Keanu, keeping a low profile as they made their way toward an unmarked van parked a few blocks away. As Keanu climbed into the back of the van, his mind raced. Who were they? The ones coming after me? Sarah closed the door behind him, the van's interior illuminated only by a dim overhead light. "We don't know exactly, but they've been tracking your movements for a while now. They know about the device. They want it, and they'll do anything to get it." "Why me? What makes me so important?" Keanu asked, leaning back in the seat. "Because you're connected to the device," Sarah said, settling beside him. "They think if they control you, they can control the device's development. You're the key to getting it where they need it to go." Keanu stared at her, his chest tightening. "This is insane. I thought this was all just about a tech project. You told me this was about saving lives." "And it is," Sarah replied, her voice softening slightly. "But there are others who see this as power, and they'll stop at nothing to use it for their own gain. You're in the middle of a war for control, and you didn't even know you were fighting." Keanu shook his head in disbelief. The weight of it all was too much to comprehend. One minute he was helping develop technology to improve the world, and the next he was being chased by unknown forces for something he couldn't even fully understand. The van's engine roared to life, and the sound filled the small space, making it feel even more enclosed. Keanu glanced out the window, the streetlights blurring past. Everything in his life had just shifted. What was once a normal day was now a distant memory, replaced with uncertainty and fear. They didn't speak much during the ride. The tension was thick in the air, each of them lost in their thoughts, understanding the gravity of the situation. Keanu couldn't help but wonder if he was making the right decision, if there was any way out of this without getting dragged deeper into something he didn't ask for. The van made several turns, driving through back streets and side alleys, until they arrived at a safe house tucked away in an industrial part of town. It was a small, nondescript building with no windows visible from the street. As they got out of the van, Sarah gave Keanu a hard look. "Stay inside. Don't go near." "Any windows?" If you need anything, let us know. We'll figure out our next steps from here. Keanu nodded, still processing everything. What now? Now, Sarah said, turning to walk toward the entrance. We wait, and we prepare. The safe house was colder than Keanu had anticipated. A dim light flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the sterile concrete walls. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by the occasional sound of footsteps outside the door. The walls felt like they were closing in on him, each second dragging out longer than the last. Keanu was pacing back and forth, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. His mind replayed the last few days in an endless loop. The diner, the agents, the sudden realization of how deeply he was entangled in something far beyond what he'd signed up for. His entire life had been a lie, or at least a carefully crafted illusion. The tech project, the device, it wasn't about helping people, it was about control, power. And now he was a pawn in a game he hadn't even known existed. Sarah, Turner, and Mallory were seated at the small table in the center of the room, speaking in low tones that Keanu could barely make out. The frustration was clear on their faces. Whatever they were discussing, it wasn't good. Suddenly, the door to the safe house creaked open. Agent Carter stepped inside, his expression grim, his eyes scanning the room like a man who had just walked out of a war zone. Anything new? Sarah asked, standing up immediately. Carter shook his head, but his face betrayed more than words could say. The opposition is closing in faster than we anticipated. They've got eyes everywhere, and they're making moves. We can't keep him here for long. It's not safe anymore. Keanu froze, the blood draining from his face. He knew what that meant. The clock was ticking. So what do we do? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though his heart was racing. You keep saying it's not safe, but where do we go from here? What's the plan? We need to get you out of the city. Sarah replied, her tone sharp, urgent. There's a facility upstate, a secure location where we can regroup and figure out the next steps. But getting you there... She stopped, shaking her head. It's going to be a hell of a journey. Carter looked at her, then turned to Keanu, his eyes hard. We're not just talking about a getaway. These people are after you, and we can't trust anyone outside this team. The device, whatever it is that makes you the target, needs to be protected at all costs. That means we have to move quickly and quietly. Keanu glanced around the room at the faces of the people around him. He had no reason to trust any of them fully, yet somehow he had no choice but to put his faith in them. They had saved his life, at least so far. But how long could that last? And what was the ultimate goal here? How do we even know we're safe at this facility? Keanu asked, his voice low, skeptical. How do I know you're not just setting me up to take the fall for something I don't even understand? Agent Carter's face hardened. You can't trust anyone right now, Keanu, not even me. But you'll have to, because if you don't, you won't make it out of here. These people, they'll do anything to get their hands on the device, and they won't care who gets caught in the crossfire. Keanu's stomach churned. The weight of the situation pressed down on him harder than ever. The walls of the safe house felt even closer now, and the suffocating uncertainty was too much to bear. How did it all go wrong? Keanu muttered, more to himself than anyone else. What was supposed to be something good turned into this. A nightmare. Sarah stepped up, placing a hand on his shoulder. Her touch was reassuring, but the look in her eyes told him that she, too, was struggling with the truth of it all. I wish I could answer that. All we can do now is keep moving, keep fighting. We'll figure it out together. Keanu nodded, though the unease in his gut wouldn't go away. How much could he trust these people? How much of what they were telling him was true? Every moment felt like a game of deception, where the lines between ally and enemy blurred with every passing second. All right, Keanu said, trying to shake off the sense of doom that had settled over him. Let's do this, I'm ready. The plan was set in motion quickly. There was no time for second guesses, no time to wait for more intel. If they were going to get Keanu out of the city, they had to leave immediately. The team moved in coordinated silence, packing up the essential equipment they'd need for the journey ahead. Turner, Mallory, and Carter double-checked every exit, ensuring they wouldn't be caught off guard. They were on edge, a tight unit that had faced danger before, But Keanu, despite his resolve, couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling that they were being watched. Every shadow seemed to loom larger, every distant noise amplified. He tried to push the fear aside, but it lingered, gnawing at him. As they filed out of the safe house, heading toward the waiting vehicles, Keanu stole one last glance at the place that had kept him hidden for the past few hours. It looked like any other building, anonymous, unremarkable, but in that moment, it felt like a fragile fortress, one that might crumble at any moment. The drive through the city was a blur, the flashing streetlights streaking past as they took the back roads, avoiding the main highways. Keanu barely recognized the streets, the feeling of disorientation making it hard to focus on anything for too long. The silence in the vehicle was deafening, every one of them lost in their own thoughts. At some point, Keanu found himself sitting in the back of the van again, staring at his hands. They were shaking. He never wanted this. He never asked for any of this. And yet, it was his reality now. "How much farther?" he asked, his voice quiet. "We're close," Turner said, glancing at the rearview mirror, his eyes alert. "We just need to make it through the next few miles. Then we'll be safe for now." Keanu hoped he was right, but deep down, he knew that this was only the beginning. The worst was yet to come. The vehicle rumbled over the uneven road, the tires crunching against the gravel as they neared their destination. The night had deepened, and the dark skies felt like an ominous curtain, suffocating the world in its shadow. Keanu stared out the window, his mind racing as the world outside blurred into a haze of motion. The tension in the air was palpable, and it seemed to thicken with every mile they drove. Sarah sat across from him, her face lit by the faint glow of the dashboard light. Her eyes were hard, focused, but there was an underlying trace of something else, a quiet, unwavering resolve that Keanu couldn't help but respect. Turner and Mallory were up front, occasionally exchanging words, but mostly silent, each lost in their own thoughts. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the rhythmic beat of Keanu's heart, which seemed to echo in the silence of the van. As they turned onto a secluded road that led into a heavily wooded area, Keanu couldn't help but feel the weight of what was coming. The safe house had been just that, a brief moment of respite. But the real challenge was just ahead. No one had been able to tell him exactly what he was walking into, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. "How much farther?" Keanu asked, breaking the silence. "We're almost there," Sarah replied, her voice calm but firm. "But I need you to stay alert, Keanu. This is where it gets dangerous." Dangerous. Keanu's stomach tightened. He had been living on the edge of danger for days, but now it felt real. Too real. The van slowed as they entered a small clearing where a squat, nondescript building loomed against the backdrop of the dark woods. The facility was hidden from view, isolated, an ideal location for their mission, or so they hoped. Sarah motioned for the team to stay close, her eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. They had arrived. As the team made their way toward the entrance, the door to the building creaked open, revealing a well-lit interior. Inside, a team. Kev technicians and agents were already set up, the atmosphere tense and efficient. Keanu felt a chill run down his spine as he stepped inside, his senses on high alert. He could see the lines of computers, the surveillance equipment, and the hardened faces of those who had been waiting for them. This was the hub, the place where everything would come to a head. Carter greeted them with a sharp nod. "You made it," he said, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of urgency. "We've got a small window to get you out of here. The opposition won't be far behind." Keanu's eyes scanned the room, noticing the rows of monitors displaying feeds from all over the city. "How do you know they're coming?" "We've been tracking their movements," Mallory answered from across the room, her fingers flying over a keyboard. "They've been coordinating a full assault. They know we're here. We don't have much time before they launch their attack." Keanu turned to Sarah, his heart racing. "So this is it? This is the last stand?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. Her gaze focused on the monitors in front of her. Finally, she nodded. "It might be, but there's something you need to understand, Keanu. The device, the reason they're after you, it's more than just a piece of tech. It's something that can change the world, and whoever controls it will have the power to reshape everything. That's why they'll stop at nothing to get to you." Keanu swallowed hard, trying to wrap his mind around her words. The device, the power, the manipulation, it all felt so far beyond anything he had ever imagined. But now, it was his reality. And it seemed like there was no escaping it. "Where do we go from here?" Keanu asked, his voice a mixture of frustration and fear. Sarah turned to him, her expression softening. "We need to destroy it, the device. It's the only way to stop them from getting their hands on it." Keanu blinked in surprise. "Destroy it? But that's everything we've worked for. It could help so many people." "I know," Sarah interrupted, her voice tight. "But the risk is too great. If they get it, they'll use it for their own gain and we'll never be able to undo the damage. You saw what they're capable of." Keanu stood there, feeling torn. The weight of the decision hung heavy in the air. Destroy the device, the very thing that had been the purpose of his entire work. Or risk giving it to the wrong people, knowing what they would do with it. Before he could voice his hesitation, the alarms in the building suddenly blared, and the monitors on the walls flickered to life with images of armed men closing in on the facility. "They're here," Carter said, his voice tense. "We don't have a choice anymore. We have to move now." Keanu's heart skipped a beat as he followed Sarah and the team down a narrow hallway that led to the facility's underground vault. The sounds of boots pounding against the ground grew louder as the enemy forces closed in, their presence now undeniable. "We'll hold them off as long as we can," Turner said, glancing back at Keanu. "Get to the vault and don't stop. Do you understand?" Keanu nodded, the adrenaline surging through his veins. There was no more time for hesitation. The final confrontation had arrived. The group reached the vault, where a large steel door loomed in front of them. Sarah quickly input the code and the door slid open with a mechanical hiss, revealing a small fortified room. Inside, the device sat on a pedestal, glowing faintly, its presence almost otherworldly. Keanu stepped forward, his breath shallow. "This is it." Before anyone could react, the sound of gunfire erupted from the hallway. The enemy was close, too close. "We need to destroy it now," Sarah shouted, moving toward the device with urgency. Keanu hesitated. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run, to protect the device. But Sarah's words echoed in his mind. "If they get it, they'll control everything." With a deep breath, he made his decision. He stepped forward and pressed the button that would trigger the device's self-destruct. The lights flickered, and the room shook as the countdown began. 5, 4, 3. As the countdown reached 0, the room erupted in a blinding flash of light and everything went silent. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?